Hello and welcome to Colred Plays Raid Shadow Legends. I am Colred. Thank you for joining me. In today's video, I am going to talk about a collection of champions that I think needs a little love here in Raid Shadow Legends, and that is tanks. Now, tanks are those tough frontline champions that protect the rest of your team and allow your nukers to grab all the glory. But you're not going to get very far without a tank or two somewhere on your roster. And so in today's video, we're going to talk about the types of tanks that exist here in Raid, the skills that they use to do their jobs, and we'll also talk a little bit about how to build them out for optimal effect. So if you're a fan of tanks like I am, you're going to enjoy this video. I hope you're ready for it. Let's get started. Just some quick channel business here. I do live stream twice a week. On Tuesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, I do my Takeover Tuesdays, where I give away free account takeovers to my viewers. And then on Sunday, we're moving our Saturday stream to Sunday at 11 a.m. My editor son and I do our Noob versus Pro series, where we take out our newbie accounts and have some fun talking to viewers and playing the game. So I hope you join us for one of the live streams. Also, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and consider joining our Discord community. Now, the first thing we have to do is define exactly what a tank is. Now, the term tank first originated in MMORPGs. RPGs, much like gacha games like the squad builders and hero collectors that we play like Raid, had a party system. So you're putting together a team that had to be effective at taking down enemies and bosses. In those games, a system arose known as the Holy Trinity. Now, in the Holy Trinity, each character played one of three primary roles. The first was tank, the second was heals, and the third was DPS, or damage dealers. It was the role of the tank in this system to draw as much attention to him or herself as possible, to become the focal point of the enemy's attacks. By doing so, they could build themselves as defensively as possible, and therefore take as little damage as possible from those enemies' attacks. That would allow the healers and the DPS champions to build themselves without a lot of defenses, so they could do their jobs more effectively, without worrying about their own survival. The healer's primary role was to keep the tank alive, and this was a very efficient method because the healer didn't have a lot of targets to focus on, but just one target to focus on, who was actually built to take as little damage as possible. Damage champions were then allowed to totally focus on doing damage without worrying about their own survival. Now, obviously, this didn't work perfectly in every case because players are players, humans are humans, and we all game a little bit differently. And sometimes DPS like to get tanks in trouble, and sometimes healers like to let DPS die, and polarity ensues. When you port that system over to a game like Raid, we do actually have the Holy Trinity here in Raid, but I would say there are additional roles that have been added to that system. And so the supports in this game are varied. There are more than just tanks and healers. There are utility champions, debuffers, buffers, shielders. There are passive mitigations. There are all sorts of different ways to prevent the enemy from doing damage, to erase the damage that has been done to your team, or to prevent it from happening in the first place. So we do want to distinguish in Raid between tanks and other supports that help to keep your team alive. Okay, so now let's talk about that primary role of tanks. Their primary role is to draw attention to themselves. And so the most iconic tank skill in all of gaming is going to be some form of taunt. Now, the initial taunt that was created in Raid was a debuff, and that is Provoke. This is the more common of the two taunt skills. So any champion that has an AoE Provoke especially, but even a single target Provoke, is at some level playing the role of tank. So this here is Drex, Blood Twin, who is a free champion that everybody can get in Raid. And as you can see from his stats, he both has a healthy HP pool and a nice base defense. Now, some tanks are going to be more focused on defense, other tanks are going to be more focused on HP, but every tank on the list should have decent HP and defense stats. As far as skills are concerned, in this particular case, we're worried about Provoke, and Drexler does have an AoE Provoke that has a 100% chance of landing if targets are under an HP burn debuff. So 100% Provokes are the best, AoE Provokes are the best. That is the most indicative of a tank. And so Drexler's going to get hit a lot, and he's going to use that to his advantage in two ways. The first is that he's got all that defense and HP, so he's not going to take as much damage as anybody else, and then the healers are going to be able to keep him alive. He may also include some way to regenerate or sustain his own HP pool. That could be a regen set, an immortal set, or in this case, some lifesteal gear. The second way he's going to benefit from the provoke is through his passive, where when he gets hit, he has a chance of placing HP burn on his attackers. So this is going to be a common system for any tank that getting hit may actually provide them with some additional benefit. Like I said, Drex is pretty old school, so this is a straightforward tanking kit. He doesn't have any sustain built in, so you're going to have to either build it into his artifact sets, or you're going to have to bring in a healer to keep him alive. Now, the second taunt provoke ability that was added to the game was actually taunt. This is a new, relatively new buff. There are only a few champions who actually have this. As you can see, the one that I have is Emic Trunkheart. Now, this is another tank. In this case, he is an HP-based tank, not a defensive-based tank. And you can see from his stats that he has a larger HP pool than Drex, but his defense is a little bit lower. Now, Emic has a lot of ways to keep his team alive, including a bunch of shields. Shields could be considered a support ability, so some tanks also play that support role. And he does help keep his enemies alive this way. But remember, the primary role of a tank is to pull the focus of the enemy, and Emic does that with his A3, where he places a taunt buff on himself for 2 turns. Now, taunt works a little bit differently than provoke. Provoke is a debuff, so it does require accuracy to land, whereas a taunt is a buff, so it requires no accuracy at all. A provoke forces the champion who the debuff is on to attack the champion that landed that debuff. So in the previous case, it would be Drex, and the champion with the debuff can only use their A1. Here with a taunt buff, Emic has to be the target of any skills, but I do believe a champion can actually use any of their skills. They just have to use them on Emic. But regardless of whether you use a taunt champion or a provoke champion, you can build these champions in a very durable manner. They're going to take less damage than other champions would, and therefore they're going to get more value out of things like heals and shields from other support champions. Because they pull all of that tension to themselves, they're going to keep the rest of your team alive and allow your nukers to do their jobs. Now, sometimes a tank doesn't have a taunt or a provoke, and that's fine. They can still do their jobs by sharing the pain of their allies, by drawing some of the damage that would be done to allies to themselves in various ways. Now, the most common of these ways is an ally protect. Now, here I have the ally protection champions on my roster, so we'll just take a look here at White Dryad Naya. Now, what she does on her A3 is she places a 50% ally protection buff on all allies except this champion for 2 turns. So even though she isn't going to be the focus target of the enemy's skills, it doesn't matter. Anybody who's under her ally protection buff will have some of their damage sent to White Dryad Naya, and they won't take that damage. So she increases the survivability of her weaker allies by sharing their damage. And again, because she's more tanky, because she has more HP and more defense, she's going to take less damage. Now, it's really important when you use an ally protector that you build in a lot of sustain either to their kit or to your team composition. In this particular case, I think it's really valuable to use a stalwart set. A stalwart set reduces the amount of damage that this ally takes from AoE attacks. So they actually get a 30% reduction by using a stalwart set. You could also use a regen set or something to regenerate the HP pool of your ally protector. But in a lot of cases, stalwart is a very good set for ally protectors, and you bring in the sustain with another champion. Now, you don't necessarily need ally protect to share the pain of your allies. You could also have a passive like Ultimate Death Knight has here. So Ultimate Death Knight's first passive, Too Awesome to Die, says whenever an ally is attacked, there is a 100% chance of completely blocking 1 hit, decreasing the incoming damage to 0. This champion, meaning Ultimate Death Knight, will receive that damage instead. It will also redirect any debuffs from the hit to this champion, and the chance of blocking a hit and redirecting the debuffs decreases to 50% if the attacker is a boss. It does not work if the attack on the ally was an AoE attack. Whenever an enemy is healed, heals this champion by 20% of that heal. So this passive means that any single target attack that goes to an enemy, the first hit of that attack will always be directed to Ultimate Death Knight. Any debuffs from that first hit will be directed to Ultimate Death Knight. And in addition, there is some sustain built into this passive so that whenever an enemy is healed, Ultimate Death Knight also receives 20% of that heal. So this makes Ultimate Death Knight a great vanguard for your team. He stands out in front, and he either has to be removed from the board in order to make it easier to kill the squishies, or you have to somehow do damage around Ultimate Death Knight. So this is a tank that just gets in the face of the enemies and protects his allies with this passive. Now, Ultimate Death Knight also has some other skills. He has a provoke on his A1, so on and so forth. But his most iconic tank ability in this particular case isn't even the provoke. I would say it's the pain sharing of Too Awesome to Die. Now, some tanks can actually fulfill this same role of being the vanguard, being out in front of their team and drawing attention to themselves, not by using a provoke or not even a pain sharing technique, but by simply making themselves the only target available. And there are a few champions who do this through perfect veils. So this is Tatura Rhymehide, who was the Christmas Fusion champion a few years ago. And this champion has this particular tank skill in spades. Okay, so with Tatura's A3 Otherworld Breach, Tatura attacks all enemies. But then here's the tank part. Places a perfect veil buff on all allies except this champion for 2 turns. Also places a shield buff on this champion for 2 turns, equal to 20% of the damage inflicted. Now, Perfect Veil prevents your champions from being targeted by the enemy. So since every ally will have Perfect Veil except Tatura, this works a lot like a provoke or a taunt. Tatura is in fact the only champion that can be targeted by the enemy. Tatura also has a shield on himself based on the damage that he inflicted, increasing his survivability a bit. And of course, he is a strong defensive-based tank, so he's going to take much less damage than another champion would. And again, like most tanks, he has at least a secondary tanking skill, in this case, increased defense and block debuffs that he can place on all allies for 2 turns, which is going to reduce the damage that his ally takes and also reduce the damage that he takes and prevent some debuffing from happening. Now, perhaps the best champion in the entire game who has this kind of ability is Duchess Lilitu. And this is where I was talking about supports and tanks kind of overlapping. You can see that Duchess is labeled as a support here. But you can see that her HP pool is nice and high. Her defense is very solid. So she has the stats of a tank. She does damage based on defense. So that is one of our requirements for a tank, either defense-based damage dealing or HP-based damage dealing. And then she has this skill here, Shroud of Souls, that places a perfect veil buff on all allies except this champion for 2 turns. Much like Tatura Rhymehide, Duchess is making herself a target, not by using a provoke or a taunt, but simply by making herself the only target available. And in fact, she does this on 2 different skills. She also has a revive on her A3, and this places a veil, not a perfect veil, but a veil buff on all allies except this champion for 1 turn. So she can actually do this with 2 different skills. A quick reminder, Veil is also a damage mitigation, so it's kind of like an increased defense or a strengthen, where it actually reduces the incoming damage to champions who are veiled by 7.5% for Veil and 15% for a perfect Veil. So I would argue that even though Duchess Lilitu is labeled as a support, the type of support that she actually is a tank, and she's one of the best tanks in all of Raid Shadow Legends. Now, the next type of tank is a little bit trickier to use because they're not really technically using any of the iconic tank skills. They create survivability for their team and they protect their team, not through a provoke, through a pain share, or through directing the targeting of the enemy to themselves, but rather they are so defensive oriented and so strong that they disrupt the enemy's ability to injure your team until they are removed from the board. So they make themselves the most important target. The enemy could choose to ignore them, but if they do, they're going to have a hard time killing your team. So I have 2 tanks like this on my roster, both of whom I love, and the first one is Valkyrie. Now, Valkyrie has a good HP pool, extremely high defense, and if we go and look at her A2 attacks all enemies, but it also places a shield buff on all allies for 3 turns on a 3-turn cooldown. It also places a counterattack buff for 2 turns. So this becomes a huge shield, which makes it very hard to kill your team. Simultaneously, it adds a counterattack, which makes your team dangerous to hit by the enemy. So unless the enemy wants to remove Valkyrie from the team, this shield is probably going to go up almost 100% of the time. That counterattack is going to be out there completely disrupting the enemy's ability to harm your team without paying a price. And then in addition, she has other skills that can also improve this ability to be disruptive. Her passive Jealousy fills her turn meter by 10% anytime an enemy champion places a buff. And then enemy champions will have their turn meters decreased by 10% for each buff they receive. So she can potentially break up a speed tune by getting turn meter fill passively when the enemy goes. So she can be disruptive in that way as well. And then finally, her A1 also decreases turn meters by 10% on each hit if the target has any buffs. So she can be extremely disruptive to an enemy team. She not only keeps your team alive and does damage based on defense, but she basically makes it impossible for the enemy to do what they want to do easily until she's removed from the board. The second champion that I have like this, who's a disruptive tank, I think is Helicath. Now, Helicath's got two great tanking abilities. The first one is his shield. His A2 is an AoE. It hits pretty hard, hits very hard, and it places a shield buff on all allies for 2 turns. The value of this shield, just like Valkyrie's shield, is proportional to this champion's defense. So it's going to be a very strong shield. He's a defensive-based champion, so he's going to hit harder the more defense he has. His shield is going to be bigger the more defense he has. So this is great synergy. Now, he's going to put this shield up for 2 turns, but then he also has a block damage buff on all allies for 2 turns on a 4-turn cooldown, which means that Helicath can keep up a defensive buff 100% of the time, either block damage or a shield. In addition, when this block damage buff is removed or it expires, it's going to be replaced by an increased defense buff. So potentially when block damage comes down, the shield goes up and you have an increased defense on all of your allies at the same time. So this is 100% uptime in terms of defenses. And then in addition, on his A1, he attacks 2 times. He has a chance of placing a weaken, but he will also ignore shield and block damage buffs, which is a great A1 and is improved by the passive. Whenever Helicath has a block damage buff up, he will counterattack anytime an ally gets hit. So when you have block damage on your team and you get hit, he counterattacks. So he counterattacks with that great A1. He is extremely disruptive. He's on the front line. He's saying, pay attention to me. He's not using a taunt or a provoke to do it. He's not giving everybody a perfect veil so he can be the only target. But he's basically saying, until you deal with me, you can't get to my team. So you have those disruptive tanks like Helicath and Valkyrie, who also do a great job in being your team composition's tank. Now, there's one last type of tank I want to talk about, and that is not when you have a tank for your team necessarily, but you have a tank who's simply unkillable in and of themselves. You can use these kind of tanks to do jobs that no other champions can do in the game. They're the solo gods of Raid Shadow Legends, and they can be built in a bunch of different ways. But like traditional tanks, they're going to be primarily defensive or HP based. They're going to have a lot of defensive focus in their kits. But because they are solo champions and they can't get their sustain from their allies, they're going to have sustain either in their builds or in their kits. One of the old school champions in Raid who does this job very well is Vergis from the High Elves faction. Now, Vergis has this A2 that places a continuous heal buff, an increased speed buff, a reflect damage buff on a target for 3 turns on a 3-turn cooldown. Also places an ally protection buff on all allies, so can in fact protect a team, but also places an increased defense buff on this champion for 2 turns. So he is an ally protector, but when he's solo, all of those buffs will land on Vergis. The continuous heal, the increased speed, the reflect damage, and the increased defense will all be on Vergis, just on this one skill. In addition to this A2, Vergis also has this passive, which synergizes very well in keeping him alive. The passive effect is places a shield buff on this champion equal to 10% of their max HP for 2 turns whenever this champion loses 10% or more of their max HP from a single hit. Now, the passive effect doesn't have a cooldown, so that can go up every single hit. The active effect does have a cooldown. It is at a 2-turn cooldown right now, but it can book down to a 1-turn cooldown. And this would place a 15% continuous heal buff on this champion for 2 turns every time their HP drops below 50%. So Vergis can get a lot of survivability out of this passive from the shield, the straight direct heal, and the continuous heal buff. And that is all in addition to the other continuous heals, reflect damage, and increased defense he gets from his A2. You can also build him in a regen set or an immortal set, and that's going to add additional sustain to his kit, making him virtually unkillable by almost anything except the very toughest of bosses. So this champion becomes a solo tank. He can, in fact, protect his team, but if he is the last one standing, or if you build him to be a solo champion, he can just prevent the enemy from killing him, and he can wear them down over time. Now, I want to point out one other champion who can also do a similar job. And again, this is a champion who is labeled a support, and I think is probably a support more than Vergis is when in a team. However, she can also be a phenomenal heal tank. So Wither the Crowned here has an A1 that places a leech and a continuous heal on a random ally for 2 turns. So the leech is sustained for your team, the continuous heal is sustained for your team. Also places an increased defense buff on all allies, and then increases the duration of all continuous heal buffs, and then instantly activates any continuous heal buffs. So you get an instant heal and a continuous heal buff from this skill. The A3 is a cleanse that also heals all allies by 30% of this champion's max HP. And again, this is a huge HP pool here at 24,000 HP. And again, close to 1200 defense. So fairly tanky in terms of defense, but very tanky in terms of HP. And that also means this heal is going to be a fairly large heal. Finally, there's a passive that places a continuous heal buff on the ally with the lowest HP for 1 turn at the start of each turn. Now, much like Vergis, this is a champion that can support a team, but when Wither is a solo champion, she is incredibly difficult to kill. Her damage is based on her defense, so she qualifies for tank status. The leech will heal her. The continuous heal from this doesn't go on a random ally if she's the only one alive, so she'll get this continuous heal. The passive won't go onto an ally with the lowest HP, it will go onto Wither, so that's 2 continuous heals. The A2 that increases her defense will also make sure that she has those continuous heal buffs extended, and then it will also activate those continuous heals for additional heals. And then finally, she can cleanse herself and give herself a huge heal on this A3. You can build Wither in a regeneration set, or you could go with something like a stalwart set to reduce the amount of incoming damage, or just a defensive set, any kind of defensive sets that improve her HP and defense. Because she probably has enough sustain and may not even need a regeneration set. And that gives you an option to potentially put her into a set that might do more damage, say against bosses like a toxic set, or maybe even a stun set for wave content, a destroy set if you needed that for, say, Scarab boss. So there are all different ways you can build a pure regeneration tank, as long as they have enough regeneration in their kit and enough defenses in their stats to keep them alive. So great support, but also a great solo tank. Now, there are dozens and dozens of great tanks in Raid Shadow Legends. They don't often get talked about. I think being a tank isn't quite as sexy as being a nuker. And even those great supports, those great utility supports out there who can do a lot of different jobs in a lot of different places are maybe a little bit more exciting than your kind of boring old just won't die tank. There are also some hybrid support tanks. I would say like Scylla the Drakes probably fits that bill. She provides some survivability to her team. She is defensive based. She has a revive, but she is more of a support champion than a tank. I think simply because she doesn't have any way to make herself the focus of the enemy team, nor does she have any way to share the pain with her ally. So I would call her probably a tanky support, and I would use that as a compliment. Okay, so that is it for today's video. Definitely let me know in the comment below, did I cover all of the types of tanks that are in Raid Shadow Legends, or do you think I missed a type? Also, let me know, do you think support champions like Duchess Lilitu actually qualify as tanks? And finally, let me know who your favorite tank is and what they do for you on your roster. What solutions have you used that require tanks to make progress on your account? I love hearing stories about tanks. Really, let me have them. You can't write enough about tanks as far as I'm concerned. Thanks so much for hanging out. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and consider joining our Discord community. I've been Colred, and I will see you in another video soon.